What if the largest wilderness on Earth isn't a wilderness at all? What if it never was? What if, and I need you to stay with me here because this is going to sound extreme before it starts sounding obvious, what if the Amazon rainforest is not a natural ecosystem but a constructed one? Not constructed the way we build things with steel and concrete and blueprints. Constructed the way only a civilization with deep, multi-generational, almost incomprehensible knowledge of living systems could construct something. Planted, designed, layered, engineered into existence over centuries, and then abandoned, left running. Like a machine someone forgot to turn off, or perhaps chose not to turn off, still doing exactly what it was built to do, feeding an entire continent's worth of biological life from root to canopy, 500 years after the hands that made it disappeared. I've spent 3 years on this question. 3 years of maps, diaries, colonial-era missionary records, botanical surveys, soil analyses, and conversations with researchers who lower their voice when they tell me what their data actually shows. And I am here to tell you, the official story doesn't hold, not even close. It started, as the most important things in this investigation always start, with something small, an anomaly, a detail that didn't fit. I was going through a collection of digitized Portuguese navigational charts, 1519, maybe earlier. The dating is itself contested, showing the interior river systems of South America. And on this map, along the river they would eventually call the Amazon, there were markings, small, careful, professional markings, the kind a trained cartographer makes when he is recording something real. Settlements, dozens of them, spaced with what appeared to be deliberate, almost mathematical regularity, connected by routes the mapmaker seemed to regard as established and known. Not speculative, not hopeful, known. I set that map down. I picked it up again. I have been unable to put it down since, because if those markings are real, if they represent what the cartographer clearly believed he was representing, then everything we've been told about the Amazon, everything requires a second look. And the second look is where this story gets strange. Let me give you the official version. Because it matters enormously that we understand exactly what we were taught before we examine what the evidence actually shows. The Amazon rainforest is a wilderness. The word is used with almost liturgical consistency across 2 centuries of scientific literature. A pristine wilderness, a virgin ecosystem, an ancient untouched biological archive developing largely unmolested by human hands for tens of millions of years. The people who lived there, hunter-gatherers, small, nomadic, dispersed, a few thousand souls moving quietly through millions of square miles of impenetrable jungle, leaving no lasting mark, building nothing that endured, knowing nothing that survived them. That is the story. It sounds reasonable. It sounds like what you'd expect. Of course it was wilderness, look at it. It is, by almost any measure, the largest and most complex biological system on the surface of the Earth. Of course it was ancient and untouched. What else would it be? But here is the thing about a system that complex. You look closer. You look longer. You bring the right questions. And the details, the specific, verifiable physical details stop adding up. They stop adding up in ways that are very hard to dismiss. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The deeper I went into the pre-Columbian literature, the primary sources, the early expedition diaries, the navigator logs, the missionary field records, the more a particular quality of description kept repeating. Curated abundance. Arranged abundance. Francisco de Orellana, descending the Amazon in 1542, described towns stretching for miles along the riverbank. Roads, populations he estimated in the hundreds of thousands. His chronicler, Gaspar de Carvajal, wrote of gardens so vast and so deliberately organized that the expedition mistook them initially for natural forest. Mistook them for natural forest. Let that sit for a moment. The official explanation for Carvajal's account is that he was exaggerating, lying to inflate the expedition's significance. Men lied in their journals. It was the 16th century. But that explanation collapses here. Carvajal had no strategic reason to invent a specifically managed Amazon. A wilderness discovery was equally valuable, equally fundable. The exaggeration theory requires us to believe he constructed a particular, elaborate, internally consistent lie, one describing managed food systems, urban settlement, and organized land use across thousands of miles, when a simpler lie would have served him just as well. And Carvajal was not alone. Explorer after explorer across the following century described rhyming things, similar structures, similar patterns of abundance, similar evidence of human management at a scale that would have required not a generation of work, not even several generations, but centuries of sustained, coordinated, deliberate design. This raises a simple but critical question. What happened to all of it? Before we get to the trees, and we are going to get to the trees because the trees are where this story becomes something I genuinely cannot explain, we need to talk about the ground, terra preta, dark earth. Found in patches throughout the Amazon basin, some of them hundreds of acres wide, it is a soil type so extraordinarily fertile that it has been studied with barely disguised obsession by agronomists since its modern rediscovery in the mid-20th century. It is not natural. Every analysis confirms this without ambiguity. Terra preta contains charcoal, bone, pottery fragments and organic material in concentrations that can only be produced by sustained intentional human activity over long periods of time. But here's the strangest part, it's still active. Centuries after whatever civilization created it disappeared from the historical record, terra preta continues to regenerate. It rebuilds itself. Modern soil science has studied it exhaustively and cannot fully replicate it. Researchers have taken its constituent materials, combined them under laboratory conditions, and produced functional soil, yes, but not this. Not something that keeps working after the hands that made it are gone. Not something that heals itself, and every single time we find terra preta, we find it beneath the richest growth, every time, without exception. As though the soil and the forest above it are not separate things, but components of a single integrated system. As though one was designed to sustain the other indefinitely. The official explanation, accumulated domestic waste, kitchen middens, cooking fires, the unintentional residue of ordinary life, does not survive contact with the distribution data. You do not accidentally engineer self-regenerating supersoil across hundreds of separate deposits spanning millions of square miles through ordinary domestic routine. The evidence suggests something much larger, a system, a sustained, intentional, breathtakingly ambitious system for building and maintaining the fertility of the land beneath an increasingly complex and deliberately managed forest canopy. And if the soil was designed, if someone made this ground, then we have to ask what they planted in it. I want to tell you about the Brazil nut, because the Brazil nut tree is, I would argue, the single most important piece of evidence in this entire investigation, more important than the maps, more important than the terra preta, more important even than the geometric earthworks we'll discuss shortly. The Brazil nut tree, Bertholletia excelsa, is one of the dominant species of the Amazon canopy. It is enormous, ancient, it lives for 500 years or more, and it dominates the upper canopy of vast stretches of Amazonian forest in concentrations that are, by any standard ecological model, extraordinarily difficult to explain. Here is why. The Brazil nut cannot reproduce without a highly specific chain of biological interactions. Its flowers can only be pollinated by a particular group of large-bodied bees, orchid bees, Eulema and Euphrasia species, that are themselves dependent on specific orchids for their mating behavior. Those orchids require specific forest conditions to thrive, and once pollinated, the Brazil nut produces a hard, woody fruit, a capsule, essentially, that is so dense and so heavily armoured that only one animal in the entire Amazon has the jaw strength to open it reliably, the agouti, a medium-sized rodent, the only animal that consistently cracks the pod and disperses the seeds. Now, the agouti buries seeds. It caches them the way squirrels cache acorns intending to return. And sometimes it doesn't return, and a seed germinates. But here is the problem that the official story has no satisfying answer for. The dispersal radius of an agouti is small, limited, a few hundred meters at most under normal conditions. The Brazil nut's seed is heavy. It doesn't travel on wind or water, and yet Brazil nut trees dominate the canopy across thousands of miles of Amazon basin in concentrations and distributions that a rodent's caching behavior, operating at natural rates over natural timescales, cannot plausibly explain. The distribution pattern of the Brazil nut across the Amazon looks less like natural seed dispersal and more like planting. Deliberate large-scale, long-horizon planting by people who understood, deeply, practically, experientially understood, that they were building something their grandchildren's grandchildren would harvest? The official explanation for this is that the current distribution reflects ancient human activity, then immediately stops asking questions about what that activity was, who organized it, how it was sustained, and why it produced the specific pattern we see today. The official explanation collapses here, because if humans planted the Brazil nuts, and the distribution data strongly suggests something like this, then what else did they plant? This is where I need you to pay close attention, because this next piece of evidence doesn't get the attention it deserves, not in mainstream literature, not in popular science, barely even in the botanical journals where it occasionally surfaces, and is then somehow not followed up on. The peach palm, Bactris gassipies. It grows throughout the Amazon in dense productive clusters. It is extraordinarily calorie dense, one of the highest yield food trees in the Western Hemisphere, producing abundant fruit multiple times per year, requiring relatively little in the way of care once established, and thriving in exactly the kind of multi-layered forest environment we find throughout the Amazon basin. It has been feeding people efficiently, reliably, abundantly for thousands of years, and it has no viable wild ancestor. I want to be precise about what that means because it's easy to gloss over it and miss the implication. Botanists have searched, seriously, systematically searched for the wild progenitor of Bactris gassipies. They have identified related species, they have mapped genetic relationships, and what they have found is that the peach palm as it exists today is essentially a domesticated organism, a tree so thoroughly shaped by human selection over such a long period of time that its closest wild relatives produce something fundamentally different, smaller, less productive, less reliable. The peach palm we find growing in wild Amazonian forest is not wild, it is feral, the descendant of cultivated trees growing in the forest because someone put them there, or because their ancestors were put there, and the forest simply continued around them after the people who planted them were gone. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. You find peach palm clusters throughout the Amazon, not randomly distributed, not following natural dispersal logic, but concentrated in areas that, when you overlay them with the terra preta distribution maps, with the known locations of ancient settlement, with the geometric earthwork sites, align. They align in ways that are very difficult to attribute to chance. This is not a wild forest that happens to contain useful trees. This is, or was, a managed system in which useful trees were placed, tended, multiplied, and distributed across a landscape at a scale so vast that, once the management ceased, the system simply kept running on its own momentum. And here's where it connects back to what we examined in previous episodes. If you've been following this series, and thank you to everyone who has, genuinely, because the collective intelligence you bring to this investigation has opened doors I wouldn't have found alone. You'll remember what we found in Białowieża, in Yakushima, in Aokigahara, 3 forests, 3 continents, all displaying the same structural signature. Edible and useful species distributed with a precision that exceeds what natural processes can comfortably explain. species preserved in forms and concentrations that suggest not just great age but deliberate protection. Forests wearing wildness as a kind of clothing over something older and more intentional underneath. And you'll remember the old world parks, the urban food forests that appeared in European and American city centres in the early 1800s, with their productive trees, their organised abundance, their layered canopy systems quietly redesigned in the park transformation movement of the 1880s and 1890s. Ornamental trees replacing fruit trees, aesthetic landscape replacing productive one. Something deliberately removed from public access and public memory. What if the Amazon is what that looked like before the removal? What if it's the version they couldn't redesign? Too vast, too remote, too alive. Marigot Island. It sits in the mouth of the Amazon Delta. It is roughly the size of Switzerland, and for a long time it was described in the literature the way most of the Amazon's was described: remote, sparsely inhabited, essentially natural. Then archaeologists started digging. What they found were tesos, massive earthen mounds, some of them 60 feet high, constructed to elevate settlements above the seasonal flood levels that render much of Marigot uninhabitable for months at a time. Not one or two of these mounds, hundreds. Distributed across the island in patterns that imply not just settlement but urban planning. A civilization that looked at a seasonally flooded island the size of a small country and decided, systematically, to engineer it into a place where people could live year-round. And on and around these mounds, in the soil, in the fill material, woven into the physical structure of the settlements themselves, ceramics, not rough utilitarian pottery, sophisticated, highly decorated, technically demanding ceramics, figurines, elaborate vessels. Art in the fullest sense of the word. Art that, when it was first properly analysed in the late 20th century, prompted genuine astonishment among specialists because its complexity and refinement implied a social structure, a division of labour, a surplus economy, a class of skilled craftspeople that the prevailing simple nomadic peoples narrative had no room for. Marigot's ceramic tradition dates back at least 2,000 years. Some estimates push further, and here's what troubles me most about Marigot. Not the mounds, not the ceramics, but the edges of the story, the beginning and the end. There is no clear origin narrative for the Marijoara culture, no agreed upon ancestor society from which they clearly descended. They appear in the archaeological record already sophisticated, already organised, already building at scale. And then they're gone. Not slowly, not through a documented decline, just diminished, scattered. The mounds remain, the ceramics remain, the knowledge of how to do what they did does not. What happened? When? And, this is the question I keep returning to, what did they know about managing that landscape, about working with the flood cycle, about planting and maintaining the food systems of that island that disappeared with them? Because Marigot Island today, even now, still produces, still grows, still feeds, in ways that local communities understand practically, but that the formal scientific literature has never fully mapped. Something is still running. Something was left behind. In 2010, archaeologists working in the Brazilian state of Acre began publishing findings about something that had been slowly emerging as the Amazon's tree cover thinned in certain areas. Geoglyphs. Massive geometric earthworks, circles, squares, complex interlocking shapes, covering an area of nearly 5,000 square miles. Constructed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago based on available dating. Some of the enclosures are 30 feet tall and 1,000 feet across. And the researchers noted, with barely disguised astonishment, that these structures were built in forest. The pollen records show continuous canopy cover, meaning whoever built them was not clearing the land. They were not deforesting to construct. They were building within a managed tree system, maintaining the canopy above while constructing vast, precise geometric networks below it. This is not a civilization that lived despite the forest. This is a civilization that lived as part of it. that designed it, that built a human world not in opposition to the biological world, but woven through it, floor by canopy by understory, with each layer serving human needs so seamlessly that once the people were gone, what remained looked indistinguishable from wilderness. Which brings us to the most important question I've encountered across all episodes of this investigation. Why did they disappear? No. Wait, that is not the right question. Not why, not when, not under which documented catastrophe or epidemic or ecological collapse. The question is, how completely? The 16th century accounts are rich, vivid, specific. They describe a living, functioning civilization of enormous scale. Then the 17th century accounts begin to thin. By the early 18th century, the interior of the Amazon is already being described in terms that will become the consensus for the next 300 years. Remote, inaccessible, wilderness. In the space of roughly 150 years, an apparently vast and complex civilization vanished so completely that within a century of its disappearance, educated Europeans were arguing it had never existed. That Carvajal had lied, that the maps were wrong, that the Amazon had always been empty and ancient and untouched. The silence was deafening. And here's what troubles me most about that silence. It's not the absence of the civilization from later records that's anomalous. Civilizations collapse, populations die. The historical record has gaps that could swallow entire worlds. What's anomalous is the speed of the erasure, the confidence with which 18th and 19th century naturalists declared the forest primordial, the near total lack of curiosity about what Carvajal and his contemporaries had clearly, specifically, professionally described. You do not dismiss eyewitness accounts that thoroughly, that quickly, without something generating the dismissal. And here, this is where the patterns from our previous episodes become impossible to ignore. The same confident institutional silence we identified around the Old World Park transformations of the 1880s. The same reclassification of managed abundance as natural landscape. The same administrative decision made somewhere by someone to look away from what the evidence showed and toward a cleaner, more convenient story. Once you've seen that pattern once, you see it everywhere. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Consider what the evidence taken together appears to suggest: a system of managed forest covering millions of square miles, built over centuries, underlaid with self-regenerating engineered soil, dominated by species that cannot explain their own distribution through natural processes alone, Brazil nuts that shouldn't be where they are, peach palms that have no wild ancestor, cacao distributed along river systems with a precision that mirrors trade route logic more than seed dispersal biology. And then, gone, within a historically compressed window, followed almost immediately by a consensus spanning Portuguese, Spanish, British, and later American scientific and academic communities that none of it had existed, that the forest was ancient and empty and untouched. Here is the coordination problem. To produce that consensus, you would need not just the disappearance of the civilization. You would need the simultaneous discrediting of the primary sources, the reclassification of the physical evidence, the institutional entrenchment of an alternative explanation across multiple nations, multiple disciplines, multiple centuries, all agreeing without appearing to coordinate that the Amazon was always wilderness. How does that happen? Not through conspiracy. I use that word carefully because it implies a level of central organization I cannot demonstrate, but through something perhaps more interesting than conspiracy, through incentive alignment, through a shared institutional need for the Amazon to be something specific. What if it was more useful to certain interests at certain historical moments for the Amazon to be wilderness? Not a managed system with living inheritors, not a technology that could be studied and replicated, not an inheritance belonging to someone. Just nature, just trees, just wilderness, inert, ownable, extractable. The official explanation collapses here, not because we can name the moment it was decided, but because the outcome, total, confident, institutionally enforced forgetting, requires more than accident to explain. The deeper I went, the more I found myself circling one idea. What if the Amazon isn't just a food forest? What if it's a library? Not of words, not of documents, but of living genetic knowledge, a deliberately assembled repository of biological diversity, so comprehensive, so carefully curated, that it functions as something like a planetary backup system. The wild relatives of tomato, potato, pepper, cassava, cacao, vanilla, rubber, concentrated in one region in densities that are, statistically, extraordinary. Species that exist nowhere else on Earth. Varieties of cultivated plants growing in nominally wild form that represent thousands of years of selective breeding now encoded into living organisms rather than written records. What if someone put them there? Not all at once. Not through a single act of deliberate archiving, but gradually, generationally, through a practice of planting and preserving and distributing that was so embedded in the daily life of the civilization that it didn't feel like archiving, it felt like living. And what if the forest we call wilderness is, in fact, that archive still running, still preserving, still holding in its biological structure knowledge that the people who encoded it are no longer alive to read? I want to be honest about the limits of what I'm suggesting. I am not telling you there was a world-spanning empire that designed the world's forests. I am not naming architects or administrators or hidden hands. I'm not in a position to do that, and I'm wary of anyone who claims they are. But the evidence suggests something much larger than what we've been told. Something that the official story, with its comfortable insistence on pristine wilderness and simple nomads, was never designed to accommodate. I think about the person who planted the first peach palm in what would become the Amazon as we understand it today. Or maybe not one person, maybe thousands of people across hundreds of years, each making careful decisions about which tree to place here, which species to encourage there, which canopy to open and which to close. People who understood with a depth of knowledge we are only beginning to approximate how living systems work, how soil builds, how a forest feeds itself, how you design something that will outlast you by centuries without ever needing to be maintained again because you built the maintenance into the biology itself. Did they know what they were building? Did they understand the full scale of it? Did they have records, documents, oral traditions, encoded knowledge that told each generation what the one before had intended? Or did they carry something more intimate than documents, a practice, a way of being in relationship with the land so embedded in daily life that it didn't need to be written down, because everyone simply knew until one generation they didn't? The Brazil nut trees are still there, the peach palms are still there, the terra preta is still there, still regenerating, still feeding the forest above it, with a patient biological intelligence that no laboratory has been able to replicate. The mounds of Marajo are still there, the geoglyphs are still there, emerging slowly into visibility as the canopy thins, as if the forest itself is finally allowing us to see what lies beneath it. Something is still running. Something was left behind, deliberately or accidentally, and it has been running quietly, persistently, at a scale that staggers the imagination for 500 years, without us. The official story says the Amazon is wilderness, ancient, pristine, untouched. The evidence says it is made, that it is the most ambitious, most successful, most durable piece of human infrastructure ever constructed. That it has been operating, largely unattended, for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. That it is still, by every biological measure, working. And that somewhere in the logic of its design, in the distribution of the Brazil nut groves, in the impossible domestication of the peach palm, in the terra preta patches still rebuilding themselves under the richest growth, in the geometry of those earthworks looking up at a canopy that was never cleared, the people who built this place left something behind, Not a message, exactly. Not a warning. Not instructions. A question. Can you see what we made? Do you understand what you're standing in? And if you do, what will you do with it?